All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, yesterday, Facebook's Oversight board announced that they will maintain President Trump's ban on that platform. Now, the board did acknowledge that while in their opinion the initial ban was justified, they thought that an indefinite ban was, quote, not appropriate, saying within 6 months of this decision, Facebook must re-examine the arbitrary penalty it imposed on January 7th. Now, the Facebook Oversight Board, it's kind of a company-appointed quasi-judicial body. Mark Zuckerberg calls it Facebook's Supreme Court. It's meant to appear as a check and balance on the social media behemoth. But of course, any board appointed by the entity it is supposedly charged with overseeing isn't worth a whole lot in terms of independence. The creation of the board was essentially a PR move by Facebook in order to distract from the immense singular power held in the person of Mark Zuckerberg. So the decision to maintain Trump's Facebook ban, it is significant. While journalists, of course, obsessed over and covered his Twitter account endlessly, it was Facebook where most of the organizing, fundraising, and grassroots message dissemination occurred. As Brad Parscale said back in 2017, I understood early that Facebook was how Donald Trump was going to win. Facebook was the method. It was the highway which his car drove on. According to Politico's Alex Thompson, Trump's Facebook posts in the home stretch of the election had some 336 million interactions. Biden's drew a comparatively small 48 million interactions. So if Trump is the GOP nominee again in 2024 and Facebook maintains their ban, Facebook would be meddling in our election to a much greater extent than Russia ever dreamed. One thing here is totally clear, though. If the goal of the Facebook and Twitter bans was to mute Trump's voice, it has definitely worked. In fact, it has worked much more effectively than I think anyone really predicted. Cable news segments on Trump have plummeted. Google search traffic for his name has returned to levels not seen since before he started his presidential run. Social media interactions about Trump have dropped an astounding 91% since he had his accounts removed on every major site. Clicks on Trump-related news stories, they have fallen precipitously as well. They dropped 80% from January to February, another 56% from February to March, and another 40% from March to April. This has all had a political impact as well. The Republican base is increasingly telling pollsters that they are more committed to the Republican Party than they are to the singular person of Donald Trump. That's a switch in the trend that has dominated over the last several years. So anecdotally, a Politico reporter also found that in an Ohio Republican primary where Trump has tried to assert his influence, few Republican voters even know which candidate he actually backed. It's hard to imagine that would have been the case back when he had his Twitter and Facebook megaphones. In other words, deplatforming works, even on the now former president of the United States. And I confess, I have personally found it wonderful to have Donald Trump out of the news cycle and out of all of our lives on a daily basis. The man does nothing but polarize, giving Democrats a convenient excuse to avoid all accountability under the guise of not giving the Trump fascist a talking point. And he makes Republicans even more substance-free and embarrassing than they usually are. But the very fact that Trump's deplatforming has been so successful is exactly the reason why it should terrify all of us. If a couple of social media giants operating in tandem can effectively mute the president of the United States, they have the power to completely erase literally anyone else. And regardless of whether or not you like Zuckerberg or Dorsey or the other all-powerful billionaires, the power is the point. We have covered numerous instances in recent months and years of left political commentators, activists, and groups being censored and deplatformed by these same companies. The Chapo Trap House subreddit was taken down. The Serfs had one of their channels taken down by YouTube before an outcry led to its reinstatement. Palestinian activists are particularly frequent targets here. How many other instances go unnoticed because the targets don't have the clout to generate pushback and call attention to their plight? YouTube's CEO outright admitted that they are engaged in a campaign of system-wide repression of independent news sources in favor of what they consider to be safer mainstream outlets. Somehow, the mainstream outlets that constantly get things wrong are never punished for their misinformation. Why? Because their errors are almost always in service of power. Whether it's the Iraq War, financial crimes, or Russiagate, their misinformation protects the status quo, so it's considered safe. Safe for who, though, is the real question, and that gets to the real point here. If your opinions, news, and analysis is safe for power, you're probably going to be just fine on all these platforms. And if it's not, then you're probably screwed. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the whole point of having a left movement or a populist movement of any sort is to challenge power. So you might think twice before you celebrate the decisions of Facebook and Twitter here. Because in the modern era, how free is your free speech if you can only communicate by postcards and carrier pigeons? And Sagar, look, it's been great having Trump gone. I've loved it. It feels amazing not having in the news cycle every day. Cable news ratings crashing. I celebrate all of it. But the fact that it has been so effective, even on the president of the United States, is actually the reason why you should be so concerned about the decisions that are being made right now.
You're right. Look, it's not up to us, and it shouldn't be. It should be up to people. It's there for everybody else to decide. Our personal preferences, or Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey or whoever, do not get to dictate the lives of everybody. That's the whole purpose of living in a democracy. And I think that this actually reveals something which is very scary to admit. Most people, the old line in 2015, it used to be deplatforming doesn't even work. What you're doing is you're just giving them a bigger audience. Here's the dirty truth. It does work. When's the last time you guys talked about Milo? I mean, I heard he came out as straight recently in some sort of attention, but hey, listen, like it barely registered in terms of the national zeitgeist. This is somebody who 4 years ago people were like throwing rocks at in whenever they were trying to speech. Now, what happened? Because he's off Twitter and he's because of Facebook.
Yeah.
There are other, I think Scott Alexander is another one who had huge YouTube audience, huge Twitter. And again, I think he's kind of a crank, but listen, the guy's dead. I mean, in terms of his views, I saw a post recently that on his own website he was getting like 3,000, where he used to garner 500,000 or whatever on an average video. And the dirty secret is that deplatforming does work. And the fact that it does work is why you should be so concerned about it.
Yeah.
Because the old counters of just, you're just making them more popular or whatever, that's actually not true. Not whenever you have monopolies, especially whenever we have in terms of working in concert like we saw in many of these efforts. And I think everybody should be afraid of it, and they should be asking how I as a person can exert power over how our speech is conducted publicly. It's not just about Facebook. It's about social media in general and our rights as Americans. We have to rethink how we approach that from a public perspective.
These platforms are so integral, not just to our daily speech and news coverage and all of that, but they're really integral to our electoral politics. So take Trump out of it, right? Imagine this is some other candidate that you have an affinity for, but who has some positions that challenge power. Facebook can casually ban them from the platform, and
anytime
Trump
they want.
Would never have won if he wasn't on Facebook. That is, Trump wouldn't have won if he wasn't on Twitter. As much as everyone likes to, pretend like they want him to put the phone down, etc., it was a core part of his appeal. It was how he drove the news cycle. It was how he was able to circumvent the established sort of channels and parties. Same thing with Bernie Sanders. I mean, that's how he was able to gain powers, by his grassroots platform.
All of his money was from online.
On all of his social media, because the media completely ignored him when he first launched, dismissed him. Hillary was going to be coronated, all of that stuff. Andrew Yang. And so if you add to it, if you just realize the power that they have to completely just pick and choose. If Trump is the GOP nominee in 2024, are they going to keep him off Facebook? I mean, that
probably,
that is, talk about election meddling. Like that bears no relationship to like the weird burning memes that Russia was putting on Facebook and that everybody said swung the election, which obviously was very silly. This would be truly shaping who people are allowed to support and allowed to vote for. And I think anyone should be really troubled by that. I mean, that's why Bernie Sanders said the same thing, that he was very uncomfortable with this direction because he sees how it can come for him.
One thing I like is that Glenn Greenwald has been pointing out that the presidents of Mexico, Germany, France, like all world leaders were like, oh, hell no. They're like, you're not going to do that to us, because other countries realize, they're like, we cannot allow our politics to be dictated by a private American corporation. It's not just dictators. Like, people of many big democracies said, no, we're not going to allow this sort of thing to happen. So if you don't think it also sent a big message to the rest of the world about private public power, you're very mistaken there.
All right, Sagar, looking forward to your radar. That is next.